Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Pete Timmerman. I'm the director of the Webster University Film Series. Just by way of introduction, I wanted to introduce the film series before we get to tonight's event. So the Webster University Film Series is St. Louis's only year-round nonprofit movie theater. We've been in operation for 42 years. We usually show movies in the Winifred Moore Auditorium, which is in Webster Hall on Webster University's main campus in St. Louis, Missouri. Since the pandemic hit, we haven't been able to do anything in person, and that remains the case as I speak. I'll come back to that point in a second. But so since March of last year, we've pivoted to doing virtual events. Of course, you know that because you're here right now at a virtual event. But we've also been doing a virtual cinema where the films that we would have programmed in person, we've been doing virtually instead. It's not an ideal circumstance, but it's a good way to keep in contact with our community and to bring good films to the community. So a few words about what we've got in the virtual cinema right now. These films can be accessed through our main website, which is webster.edu/film series. And if you follow us on social media, there's easy ways to get to these films there too. On Twitter and Instagram, we're at WU Film Series, and on Facebook, we're at Webster Film Series. But so as I speak, there are 4 films in the virtual cinema, but they all close at the end of the day today. In all 4 cases, if you rent them tonight, you'll get the full rental period. So just the fact that they're not going to be in our virtual cinema anymore after tonight, if you pay the $10 or $12, you'll get the full rental period, which is between 3 and 7 days, depending on the movie. So the 4 films that are there now, there's a Bosnian kind of road trip coming of age type of movie called Take Me Somewhere Nice, which that one's a $10 rental. You get it for 7 days. There's one called Who Will Start Another Fire, which is a compilation of short films by young BIPOC directors. That one's, I can't remember if it's 10 or 12, but it's a 5-day rental period. And then there's Power of Gangwon Province, which is Hong Sang-soo's second film from 1998. Hong Sang-soo is a very prolific South Korean director who went to grad school at the University of Chicago, incidentally. So he's kind of an honorary Midwesterner. He tends to make a movie or 2 a year. He's been kind of increasingly popular in the St. Louis community, and he's been increasingly popular all over the world for 15 or 20 years now. We've been kind of slow to catch on to the Hong Sang-soo train. But anyway, his second film, Power of Gangwon Province, was recently restored, and it has a new translation. So we have that in the virtual theater. And then there's a new American independent film called Slow Machine, which among other people stars Eleanor Friedberger of the band The Fiery Furnaces. Like I said, all 4 of those films close after the end of the day today. Both Gangwon Province and Slow Machine are only 3-day rentals if you were to rent them tonight. But then tomorrow we have one new film opening. It's Crimson Gold, which is a 2003 Jafar Panahi film. Jafar Panahi is the guy, he's been under house arrest in Iran, which he's an Iranian filmmaker. But he's the one, he made This Is Not a Film and Tehran Taxi and a few others while he's been under house arrest. He's not legally allowed to make movies, but he's making movies anyway and getting them smuggled out of the country. You've probably heard about this. He's that guy, but this is before he went under house arrest, Crimson Gold. It's made from a script by Abbas Kiarostami, who he worked as an assistant director under for a handful of years before he took over as director. Or not took over, before he just became a director in his own right. But yeah, that opens tomorrow, and I'm really fond of that film, Crimson Gold. So I hope that some of you listening right now check it out. This is our second to last of these events, the Preminger series. It was supposed to be the last, actually, but our Carmen Jones event got rescheduled. So a week from today, we've got Renee Thomas Woods on Carmen Jones, which was the event that was supposed to happen 2 weeks ago. But then after that, we're going on a hiatus. And what happens after the hiatus is yet to be determined. I haven't given up on the idea of doing more virtual events, but there probably won't be any at all in July, aside from the one a week from tonight, which is on July 1st. But we're going to spend that month regrouping, working on reopening for in-person screenings, which are expected to happen in mid-August. I guess now is as good a time as any to say, with regards to reopening, nothing's confirmed yet. I can't absolutely promise anything, but almost definitely the last 2 weekends in August, we're going to do the Classic French Film Festival in partnership with Cinema St. Louis, and both Robert, tonight's speaker, who I'll introduce more formally in a second, and myself are doing 2 of the presentations, the 6 presentations at Webster. You're looking at 2 of them right now, basically. Robert's doing 2 English Girls on August 28th, and I'm doing 2 English Girls is a Francois Truffaut film, if it doesn't ring a bell, and I'm doing Viva Sa Vie, the Jean-Luc Godard film, which is one of my 10 favorite films ever. I don't know exactly what day I'm doing it. Sometime in late August I'm doing it, but you've got that to look forward to. I'll probably be able to reopen 1 weekend before Classic French, but again, that remains to be seen. And earlier today I announced, if you're familiar with the Japanese filmmaker Nobuhiko Obayashi, the guy that made House back in '77, which we showed at the film series in 2010, there's his second to last, third to last, and fourth to last films are a trilogy of films based in World War II. But we're going to show all three of those films in person, probably in September, which we're really looking forward to. House is a favorite among my film students at Webster. And me, I saw House when I showed at the film series. I saw it all 3 times. It was before I worked here. Anyway, so I guess first I wanted to thank Cliff Freilich. Cliff is a mutual friend between Robert Garrick, our speaker tonight, and myself, but it's because of Cliff that I met Robert, so I owe him a thank you for hooking us up. Cliff isn't in the audience tonight, actually. He's on vacation right now, but if he ever sees this video, I thought it would be nice to thank him anyway. And then while Robert is presenting, and then when the presentation is over, his presentation will last something like 30 minutes. And then at the end, we'll have time for a Q&A session. So please be ready with your questions. If you want to drop questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen at any time, including during his presentation, that actually kind of helps me transition from his presentation to the Q&A section. So don't be shy about dropping them right in there. Just, yeah, at the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A. You can also put them in the chat, but I have a tendency to miss them there. So as for Robert, after that long and rambling, that's Teddy in the background, for those of you who are curious. So as for Robert and Teddy, Robert ran his college film society, but when he ran his college film society, he hosted people like Frank Capra and Andrew Saris, which I find terribly impressive. I have a book signed by Frank Capra. I've never met Frank Capra though. That's I would anyway. I think that's terrific. But he studied film at a graduate level at NYU and Columbia University, but then you pivoted for reasons that I'm not entirely clear on and went to law school at the University of Chicago, which is Hong Sang-soo's alma mater. But now he's a practicing attorney. But between being a cinephile with a very strong academic background, you published on Dave Kerr's film blog, you're a frequent speaker at Cinema St. Louis events, but then also being an attorney, you're kind of uniquely suited to talk about Anatomy of a Murder. And you've also, I guess I heard by way of Cliff, haven't heard this from you directly, but apparently Preminger is one of your favorite filmmakers too. So I've been very excited, and I'm grateful for the time that you spent on this presentation. And with that, I'll get out of the way and let you take the floor.
My name's Robert Garrick, and we're here to talk about Otto Preminger and his 1959 film Anatomy of a Murder. I have quite a bit of material, and it's all pretty good, I think, so hang on. This is one of Preminger's 2 most heralded films, along with Laura. He's made other great films, but he never made a film that was as popular with the public and with the critics immediately and for decades after that as Anatomy of a Murder. It got 7 Oscar nominations, all the big ones: picture, editing, cinematography, writing, and 3 acting nominations for James Stewart, George C. Scott, and Arthur O'Connell. So what's missing? Well, there was no Oscar nomination for director for Otto Preminger. Why not? Because people hated him. Preminger was not well liked by the Hollywood establishment, and really he wasn't even part of the Hollywood establishment, which was one of the reasons they didn't like him. He produced his own films, he raised his own money, he kept offices in New York City and often made his films on location elsewhere, as he did with Anatomy of a Murder. And we'll be talking a lot about that. He was an outsider, an outlaw, but he was also a star. And in 1959, there were 2 American film directors who could use their celebrity to sell their films, whose name alone would get people into the theaters. Only 2. People didn't know who directors were back then. They just went to see movies and they cared about stars. But these 2 directors were Otto Preminger and Alfred Hitchcock. So why didn't people like Preminger? Well, during the filming of Forever Amber, which was 1947, Otto Preminger yelled at Linda Darnell almost daily for 2 months until she collapsed on the set and was ordered by a doctor to take 10 days off to convalesce. When he was making Angel Face around 1954, Preminger asked Robert Mitchum to slap Gene Simmons so many times, hard, that finally Mitchum turned around and slapped Preminger. In rehearsals for the production of Herman Wouk's A Modern Primitive, which is a play that never made it to Broadway, Preminger screamed so violently at an actor who struggled to remember his lines that the poor man suffered a nervous breakdown and was taken away to spend the next 4 months in a sanitarium. I had never seen such terrifying rage in anyone, said one witness, who described the director with veins standing out on his forehead and literally foaming at the mouth. Notice literally here means literally. On the set of the comedy The Moon is Blue, Maggie McNamara, a jittery newcomer with a fragile ego, was a victim of Preminger's tantrums. McNamara was to commit suicide in 1978, wrote Preminger biographer Foster Hirsch. The list of jittery actresses with fragile egos reduced by Preminger to tears also includes Marilyn Monroe, Gene Seberg, and Dorothy Dandridge. All suicides as well, it is perhaps unfair to note. And Jean Tierney, who was in Laura, spent time in an insane asylum, and Jean Simmons was an alcoholic and had some mental issues of her own. Well, was Preminger really as bad as all that? A lot of it was an act, but to the people on the receiving end, it didn't seem like an act. Preminger, like Alfred Hitchcock and Cary Grant and some others, created a persona because it worked for him. He said, I can be a nice guy, but I find I don't get results as quickly when I'm like that. But when he was in public around people he respected, he was a normal guy and you'd be happy to go to dinner with him. So, you know, to some degree it was real. And some of Preminger's shoots, some of his films were sheer hell for the actors. There is one actress I know a little bit, and she's still alive, so I don't want to mention her name. She's fairly famous, and she was in one of his biggest titles, and she had nothing good to say about him, nothing good to say about him. But that's just how he was to some of the actors and actresses. Anyway, tonight's film happened to be a very pleasant and trouble-free production, and the resulting film was a success in almost every way. Anatomy of a Murder got rave reviews when it was released in summer 1959. The leading film reviewer in America back then was a guy named Bosley Crowther, who had been at the New York Times for decades. I didn't say he was a good reviewer, but he was the leading reviewer. And he said the film was well-nigh flawless as a picture of an American court at work, of small-town American characters, and of the average sordidness of crime. The film did huge business. It was top 10 box office for the year, and it made Preminger rich. Not that he was hurting before. Preminger always lived the grand life from his youth in Europe until the year he died in 1986 when he was 80 years old. He was just a very lucky guy in life. Anatomy of a Murder continues to be widely admired. When Sight and Sound did its poll of the world's critics in 2012, 4 of them voted Anatomy of a Murder one of the 10 best films ever made. They'll be doing that poll again next year. We'll see how it holds up. And in 2012, Anatomy of a Murder was added to the National Film Registry at the Library of Congress. So this is a standard work here. This is an accepted great film. All right, I'm going to talk about the film first and more about Preminger as a director later. You know, some of this presentation will be tabloid stuff and some of it will be fairly heavy academic type stuff, which is how I normally am. And you can ask questions on either side. I go for it. But I do want to say this right at the front. Preminger is important. He was a great artist. I believe he's one of the best film directors of all, just behind the very top rank. And I'm not alone in that belief. There was a film magazine out of Oxford and Cambridge in England called Movie that was the most influential film journal in the world back in the 1960s. The critics at Movie, who included people like Robin Wood and V.F. Perkins, ranked only 2 English language directors higher than Preminger, Alfred Hitchcock and Howard Hawks. But it gets even more powerful. Modern film criticism was invented in France in the 1950s at a journal called Cahiers de Cinéma, which translates roughly to film notebook. No film journal in history was more important than Cahiers was in the 50s. Its impact was revolutionary, and most of the critics at Cahiers went on to become great directors in their own right. They were the new wave directors in France. Francois Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, who's still alive, Eric Romer, and our host, Pete Timmerman, will be introducing one of his films in August. Eric Romer, Jacques Rivette, Claude Chabrol, all giants as critics, all giants as directors. And these were the critics who first figured out that Preminger was one of the greatest directors because they were looking at the picture. You know, it was a different language. They were in France and they were reading subtitles, but they were looking at the picture on the screen and saying, oh my goodness, look at this. In the early 50s, Preminger made a film called Angel Face, and he made another film called The Moon is Blue. This is like 1954. And when writing about those 2 films and Preminger's visual style, Jacques Rivette asked the question, what is mise-en-scène? And that is the moment modern film criticism began, with a question about a Preminger film. Mise-en-scène is the almost mystical thing that a director does. It's the stuff that appears inside the 4 corners of the image. To the French critics and to the American and English auteur critics who followed their lead, Preminger was a master of mise-en-scène. All right, back to Anatomy of a Murder. It's possible that some of you haven't seen it, and that's okay. There will be no spoilers here. Watch without fear. You can't spoil this film because we never find out what happened. This is a film about a rape and a killing, not necessarily a murder, and a long trial. It's a film about enigmatic characters with unsettling personal issues. It's a film about a small town that has its equilibrium disturbed by a killing. The crime happens before the film starts. We gather clues and information along with the lead lawyer in the film, who's played by James Stewart. We follow him around. He's essentially the film's narrator. There are no flashbacks. Preminger hated flashbacks, although I believe he used them in Bonjour Tristesse, but he didn't like them. As the film begins, we meet Stewart, who spends most of his time fishing in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, or UP, which is where he lives. He had been the district attorney for the region, the prosecuting attorney, and he'd been reelected many times, but he lost the last time. So now he's older, probably 50 or 55 years old, I would guess. He catches a lot of trout and he stuffs them into the refrigerator. That's how the film begins. He has a friend played by Arthur O'Connell, a scholarly old lawyer who's also a drunk. And he has an extremely loyal personal assistant played by Eve Arden, who at the time, 1959, was very famous because she'd been the star of a TV show called Our Miss Brooks. She's also a great actress and a very appealing character in this film. James Stewart hasn't paid Eve Arden in a long time because he doesn't have the money to pay her. And he doesn't seem too worried about that. But she keeps working for him, and she's an absolute gem. She's competent and she's smart. Anatomy of a Murder is based on an actual crime. It's based on actual events, as they say these days. The crime occurred at the Lumberjack Tavern on Michigan's Upper Peninsula. A soldier thought his wife had been raped, and he walked into the tavern and in front of everybody shot the bartender in cold blood. Then he walked out and went home. At trial, that soldier was represented by a lawyer named John Volker. We're talking about the real event now, not the movie. Volker had been the local district attorney, but he had lost the last election. So he spent most of his time trout fishing before taking this case. Now, obviously, the James Stewart character is based on Volker. And it was Volker, under a pen name, who wrote the book, Anatomy of a Murder, which was a massive bestseller. It spent a whole year on the New York Times bestseller list, made Volker rich, and allowed him to spend the last 30 years of his life trout fishing, which is really all he wanted to do. The book and then the movie are only slight departures from the actual events, and the location is the same. It's the freezing Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the off season without any tourists. The locals are smoking and drinking, killing time, freezing their rear ends off. When Preminger arrived with his cast and crew to shoot the film, the temperature there was 35 degrees below zero when the train arrived at Ishpeming Station at 6:30 in the evening. That arrival was filmed and it was shown on the Ed Sullivan Show a week later, which was another publicity stunt by Preminger. Preminger had read Volker's book and immediately knew he wanted to make it into a movie. Preminger was a lawyer. That's important. It's a key to his worldview. He was born in Poland in 1905, but mostly he lived in the vicinity of Vienna, which was a world center back then. It was the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Preminger's father was a very important man. He was essentially the Attorney General for Austria-Hungary. Preminger's mother was a socially prominent woman, and the family was Jewish. Otto got a law degree in Vienna to make his father happy, but he also studied theater under Max Reinhardt as a teenager. He knew that the theater was his future, but he successfully studied law because he wanted to make his dad happy, and he was good at it. He just never practiced. But he wasn't one of these guys who screwed around in law school and dropped out. No, he got his degree and he was a good student. And legal training changes the way you see the world, which is important for Preminger. The book and Preminger's movie represent a new kind of courtroom film. Dave Kerr is a film critic who I think is a very, very good critic, although currently he's a curator at the Museum of Modern Art. But he wrote that the film resists the genre's usual function of reestablishing order after the chaos of violent or antisocial acts. The film becomes one of the great courtroom dramas by systematically undermining most of the pleasures and reassurances that the genre provides. In Anatomy of a Murder, we never find out what happened. That's the key to the film. It's a movie about process. It's about the justice system in America, and it's about human behavior. It's an unblinking look at a dozen flawed characters as they address a major upset in a small town. We like these characters in most ways. In other ways, we don't like them, but they're all kind of a mix. Back to the story. So James Stewart, the lawyer, is encouraged to take the case, but he doesn't really want to. He's kind of fundamentally a lazy guy, just wants to fish. Very smart guy, very competent guy, but who wants to work if you don't have to? He meets the soldier who did the killing, and that's the guy played by Ben Gazzara in the movie, and Stewart doesn't like him very much either. Doesn't, he thinks he's okay, but he's not crazy about him. And then Stewart meets the soldier's wife, who is the woman who was supposedly raped. She's played by Remick as a flirtatious trailer park sex pot type. Her first words to Stewart are, "You're tall." Now, was she really raped, or was she just fooling around with the bartender? That is one of the film's mysteries. We do learn that Remick passed a lie detector test. That is important, but it's something the jury is not supposed to know about. We know about it, the viewers. And Stewart, as a matter of fact, gets it out in court anyway, which he's not supposed to do, but he's a good lawyer. He figures out how to do that. So, should Stewart take the case? It would give him something to do besides fish. In court, he'd be up against the new district attorney. Remember, that's the guy who beat him in the last election. So there's that competitive element, and he could use the fee because he hasn't paid Eve Arden. He takes the case. Of course, he has to take the case or we wouldn't have a movie. I want to talk about James Stewart's acting for a moment. It's astonishingly good. Ben Gazzara, who played the soldier, had been at the Actors Studio with Lee Strasberg, which was the hot thing back then in the 50s. It's what Marlon Brando did. It's what James Dean did. And it's also Lee Remick, the co-star in Anatomy of a Murder, did it. And they were all method actors, is what they called them. Gazzara was very serious about his acting, and Stewart was just an old movie star. He dated back to the mid-30s. But Gazzara, who appears in a major role here for the first time, took a look at Stewart and said, "I watched in awe. I said, holy shit, look at this. Actors Studio, Schmachter Studio. This guy can act. How natural, how simple. What a sense of humor, tongue-in-cheek. How he can pause and hold it forever, hold your attention." And it's true. It's easy to miss if you just watch the film because Stewart seems so natural. But everything is carefully and brilliantly done. Stewart was simply a genius at looking like he wasn't acting. And all the while, he keeps your attention. He's interesting. And he reads his lines correctly, and he gets out of them what the writer intended. Now, George C. Scott, his acting also got a lot of attention here. He had been impressive on Broadway, and Preminger was very familiar with what was going on in Broadway. Remember, he lived in New York, and he always went to the theater, and he had been a great theater director himself in Europe. And this is George C. Scott's first major screen role. He went on to have a great movie career. He won an Oscar for Patton. He was in Dr. Strangelove, a terrific actor. But when you watch George C. Scott, you're generally aware that he's acting, and you're saying, man, that was a great little bit of business. You don't think that with Stewart, because with Stewart, it seems like you're watching a real person. An interesting real person. All right, I mentioned earlier that the entire shoot, every single moment, was done on site in and around Ishpeming, Michigan, on the banks of Lake Superior in winter when it was ridiculously cold. Many of the locations that figured in the original crime were the same locations used in the film. We never see the crime in the film. There are no flashbacks. And when the movie begins, the events have already occurred. But we do have a number of scenes in the bar in the film. And the bar in the movie is the actual bar where the bartender was shot. Today, that bar, which is called the Lumberjack Tavern, remains open, and it's a big tourist attraction. There's an outline on the floor where the body fell, and it's the logo from Anatomy of a Murder. Still a big deal up there. And I'm sure, the ancestors of the guy murdered are amused that it's a big tourist attraction, the place where this guy fell and died. That's America as a great country. Okay, then there's the courthouse. In the movie, Preminger shot the trial at the Marquette County Marquette County Courthouse, which is another beautiful building that's still standing in Ishpeming. And that is the same courthouse where the actual trial took place. For James Stewart's house in the movie, they used the house of John Volker, tacky wallpaper and all. Remember, John Volker is the character on whom James Stewart's character is based. There's a couch in there that Lee Remick sprawls on while she's talking to Stewart and flirts with him. And that couch is still there. And the view out the window is the same in 2021 as it was when the film is made in 1959. You can go in there now. It's a tourist attraction. Volker died, by the way, in 1991, 87 years old. Ishpeming Carnegie Library, which opened in 1904, was used as the law library in the film. Volker was a lifelong patron of the library, and 300 citizens of Marquette County worked as extras. They were paid $10 a day for their work. So here's the question. Was any other film in movie history ever made more on location than this one? Maybe Nanook of the North, but not too many. Every shot was on the Upper Peninsula. There's not a studio shot in the entire film. The entire cast and crew stayed together in the same hotel. They ate all of their meals together, banquet style, usually at the hotel. At night, they'd go to a bar, and some of them, George C. Scott in particular, would get drunk with his wife, Colleen Dewhurst, who was also an alcoholic. Duke Ellington was there the whole time, composing the score to the movie. He'd play piano at the bar while everybody drank at night. It's not a bad life. And then they'd go to sleep and be up in time for the next day's shooting. It wasn't just the cast and crew. The family members were there too and were encouraged to stay for the whole shoot. Remember, I said it was a very pleasant shoot. The judge in the case was played by Joseph Welch, and his wife was there playing a juror. Joseph Welch was the lawyer, or the lawyer in the Army McCarthy hearings who said, "Have you no decency, sir, at long last?" He plays the judge in this film. And he's 68 years old, and Preminger said, "I have a brand new 68-year-old face." But that was another publicity coup for Preminger, getting this famous figure to be in his film. Lee Remick at the time was a nursing mother. She had given birth a few months before, so she was there with her husband and baby. Ellington was there with his common-law wife, and Billy Strayhorn, who was Ellington's musical associate, was also there. George C. Scott brought his wife, Colleen Dewhurst, as I mentioned. They're all there at the same hotel, eating together in these freezing temperatures. This was not standard procedure for Hollywood. Preminger didn't participate in all this collective eating and drinking because he knew if he did, it would be disruptive. You can't have fun and flirt and drink when your parents are watching. So Preminger hung out with Volker, the judge-turned-lawyer who was the model for Stewart's character. Preminger and Volker really hit it off, which was one of the reasons Anatomy of a Murder was such a congenial, successful shoot. The film is very long. It's 2 hours and 40 minutes, but it doesn't seem long when you watch it. It doesn't seem rushed, certainly, but it doesn't seem long either. It moves quite deliberately, and it's very entertaining. One critic wrote that Anatomy of a Murder luxuriated in its running time. The trial doesn't start until we're an hour into the film, and even then there are many cutaways to the town. Preminger does a nice job of mixing the courtroom scenes with other bits of business where Stewart has to meet with witnesses or gather information or visit Arthur O'Connell in the hospital. He's in the hospital in the movie, and he was in the hospital in real life because he caught pneumonia while he was making the movie in this freezing city. But he got an Oscar nomination out of it, so it's okay. And the trial scenes, you know, they're mixed in with other stuff, but the trial scenes are a highlight. We relish them. They're riveting. So Preminger did a good job with that. There are a lot of courtroom films where I fall asleep, unless it's Bananas or Lady from Shanghai or Duck Soup. Those are my idea of trial scenes. I mentioned Duke Ellington, whose real name was Edward Kennedy Ellington. Some of you probably know that he's one of the great figures, and I mean really great figures, in the history of American music. Not just jazz, but all American music. From the 20s until he died in 1974, Ellington was a giant, and he remains a giant today. And his score for Anatomy of a Murder was a landmark, it was a landmark. It was the first pure jazz score ever done for an American film. It's always in the background. It doesn't send cues to the audience. It's not in your face. It's actually used fairly sparingly. It's never in the courtroom scenes. It's strictly for the shots in town, generally when nothing else is happening, when somebody's walking or when somebody's driving in a car. And the music feels sort of whimsical, sometimes almost a little bit goofy, but there are also ominous touches. At the end of the movie, you'll feel that. And it's there, and it's a major part of Anatomy's greatness. The soundtrack album for this film is considered one of the great movie soundtrack albums. All right, I mentioned earlier that Preminger was not nominated for Best Director by the Academy. Neither was Duke Ellington for Best Original Score. And that's nice work by the Academy, because today the film is remembered mostly for two reasons, because of Otto Preminger and Duke Ellington. The third reason would be James Stewart's brilliant performance. And Stewart was nominated, but he didn't win. The winner that year was Charlton Heston for Ben-Hur, another endlessly long film. but it's harder for me to watch Ben-Hur than it is to watch Anatomy of a Murder. I could talk for a half an hour now, probably longer, on the history of the Oscars and how they got so much wrong and why, but that will have to wait for another time. So we are back at the film and at the trial. At the trial, there's a great deal of talk about panties, about rape, about the violation of Lee Remick and how that's an element of rape. We hear about semen, intercourse, ejaculation, sexual climax, and spermatogenesis. Remember, this is 1959. These words were not used in public, let alone in the movies back then. For Preminger to litter his film with these references was something new. Was he doing it because it was necessary? Well, it was organic. It's not incorrect, but it wasn't necessary. A lot of it wasn't in the book. Preminger did it for several reasons. First of all, it is relevant to the story, but second, he knew it would be great publicity. He knew it would be a scandal, and that would lead to stories and the public would line up to see the film. Sex sells. People would have gone to see this film anyway. I think it would have been a hit no matter what. But Preminger was right. It didn't hurt. The film was banned for a while in Chicago until a federal judge allowed it to be shown. That's the second biggest city in America back then. James Stewart's own father told his friends not to see the movie. He said it was a dirty picture. And you add all that up and it means lots of box office. Never before in history had a film contained as many references to rape as this one, let alone spermatogenesis. The production code people asked Preminger to remove most of the words, and he refused, as he generally did. And Preminger won, as he generally did. The film was released with almost everything intact, and it came with the production code's approval. And the movies were never the same again. Just to remind you of what things were like back then, Psycho was released about a year later, and the big issue with that film was not Janet Leigh being carved up in the shower, nor was it the crazed cross-dressing murderer. The big production code controversy in Psycho was that it showed a toilet for the first time in the history of the movies. Never before had a toilet been shown on screen, and never before had a toilet been flushed in a movie. Could America handle it? Well, they did, because both of those things got through, and we're still here to talk about it. Back to the trial. As mentioned, the viewers never learn any new facts from these scenes. We already know everything that Stewart knows, and we know everything that the prosecuting lawyer, George C. Scott, knows. The whole story is the show, the legal process itself, the way the lawyers perform on that stage. Stewart is brilliant as he makes, and I mean brilliant not just as an actor, but brilliant as a fake lawyer. He's brilliant as he makes little jokes, which he pretends are spontaneous. He says things that he knows he's not supposed to say, and then the judge strikes them and chews Stewart out. The jury will disregard that information. And then Ben Gazzara asks Stewart, how can a juror disregard something he just heard? He can't, says Stewart. He can't. This happens over and over again. Stewart is a master, and he's got the judge wrapped around his finger. But the prosecuting side is good too, and they've got some facts on their side. All they have to show is that Gazzara wasn't temporarily insane when he shot the bartender. To do that, they try to undermine the notion that Gazzara's wife, played by Lee Remick, was raped. Maybe she was just having a fling with the bartender. There are delicious scenes where George C. Scott, whose character is named Claude Dancer, dances up to Lee Remick in the courtroom, dancing figuratively, of course, almost seducing her. He sidles up to her and he says, "Do you always wear Miss Panties, Mrs. Mannion?" The evidence, as presented in the screenplay and in the film, is absolutely evenly balanced. Gazzara is credible when he says he must have been mad, meaning crazy, when he shot the bartender. I think he's credible. And if that's true, then there's reasonable doubt and he should be found not guilty. And that's exactly what happens. Based on the law at the time, which has since been changed, the verdict seems appropriate to me. Based on the law at the time and on the evidence, there is reasonable doubt of Gazzara's guilt. He might actually be guilty, of course. Reasonable doubt doesn't mean innocence. James Stewart doesn't know if Gazzara is really guilty, and neither does George C. Scott, who is the prosecutor, or Joseph Welch, the judge. And we don't know either. A lot of critics who wrote about this film act like they do know. Well, they don't know, and those are bad critics because the evidence in this film is absolutely evenly balanced. And this all goes to why we have trials. And this is something that Preminger, the lawyer, knows well. The point of a trial is not to find the answer. The point is to put an upset to rest. There's been a violent crime. The community must deal with it. So there's a trial and 12 citizens representing the community render a decision. That brings closure and life can go on. The verdict might not be correct. Often verdicts are not correct, but the formality of a trial brings closure. And since the jury represents the community, it usually brings closure that the community can deal with. When the verdict is rendered in Anatomy of a Murder, the courtroom cheers, so the community is happy. The next day, Stewart goes to meet with Gazzara to collect his fee, and he finds that Gazzara has skipped town with his wife, Lee Remick. He hears that Remick was crying, and Gazzara leaves a cryptic note to the effect that he had an irresistible impulse to leave. Ha ha ha. Does this mean that Gazzara was guilty and that the whole thing was a joke? No, it doesn't mean that. We still don't know what happened. We don't know if Lee Remick was really raped. We don't know if she was punched in the face by her husband. She has a big shiner early in the movie, which she said she got from the rapist, but maybe it was her husband that did it. We don't know. We don't know if Gazzara was temporarily insane when he shot the bartender. We don't know. Stewart doesn't know. Nobody knows but the actual people. And when they talk about it, there's no way to be sure they're telling the truth. Now I want to spend a moment talking about Preminger and his style, which is the key to why he's important. We're back to that thing the French called mise en scène. Mise en scène is what the film director does. It's the film director who decides what to show on screen, how to frame the shot, when to cut to a new shot, and how to move the camera. When you read the best critics write about Preminger, they talk about his objectivity. That's the word, objectivity. Preminger is objective, meaning that he's fair with his characters. He doesn't judge them. He doesn't try to convince the viewers that character A is good and character B is bad. More likely, they're all a mix of good and bad. When Preminger shot a film, he'd use wide shots, showing all of the players in a scene at the same time. The viewer sees it all and he has to figure out what's important. The director isn't giving any hints by shooting one person and then another. Preminger didn't like to cut. He thought it interrupted the action. I'd shoot the entire film in one shot if I could, he said. Preminger's moving camera shots are a thing of beauty. Really, they are. And if you think about it, you'll never see one of his films again because that camera just glides through the film. But that's not why he did them. He didn't do them because they were beautiful. Quite the contrary. He did them because he wanted to keep all the important information in the frame at the same time without giving any clues to the audience about what was important. Foster Hirsch wrote a good biography of Preminger, and he said Preminger never cuts to make a point. So this is Preminger's mise en scène, beautiful wide shots of the action with the camera moving to keep the scene alive for as long as possible. Always Preminger is fair with his players, and it's up to the viewer to decide who has the higher moral standing. Two things about Preminger are important here. One, he was trained as a lawyer, so he sees both sides of every issue. A lawyer has to know all of the arguments. A good lawyer really could argue either side of a case before a trial starts. You have to be ready to handle the other side and your side, and then you can do it. And a good lawyer also knows that cases are complicated and people are complicated. At one point in Anatomy of a Murder, James Stewart says, I've learned that people are not just good or bad. People are many things. And that's Preminger's viewpoint in a nutshell. Okay, that's one thing about Preminger, that he was a lawyer. The other thing about him is that he came from the theater. He was a brilliant and successful stage director in Europe in the 1920s, following his training with Max Reinhardt. On stage, you don't have the option to cut or to lead your audience around by the nose. It's all up there. All of the players are visible and the audience has to figure it out for themselves. And that obviously made an impression on Preminger because his films are like that too. What about Preminger's worldview? What is he all about? What was his theme as an artist? Andrew Sarris, who I knew a little bit and who I regard as the most important film critic who's ever lived, he died in 2012, I think, wrote that in Preminger's impassive long takes, different ideologies and points of view battle for dominance. His films emphasize pragmatism, but gravitate toward irony, doubt, and enigma. That's kind of a dense sentence, complicated sentence, but boy, it's all in there. And so it is with Anatomy of a Murder. At the end of the film, we're left with irony, doubt, and enigma. The overall feeling when the film ends is not that we're devastated. but it's kind of perverse amusement. And also there's a feeling of inevitability. And you look at James Stewart and you can tell that's what he's thinking too. Nothing has been resolved. The film's mysteries are still open. There's been a lot of movement, a lot of stuff has happened, but not much constructive change. And let's review by looking at all the individual characters. You've got Eve Arden, James Stewart's loyal assistant. She still hasn't been paid. You got, and what she's using for money, I don't know. You've got Stewart and O'Connell, and they're supposed to start an alliance as a new legal team. But do we think that's going to work? Stewart would rather fish, and O'Connell would rather drink. Certainly, they'll take care of each other. Stewart cares about O'Connell, and he won't let him drink himself to death, probably. Probably. But it feels a little too hopeful. Ben Gazzara leaves town unchanged. Perhaps the verdict was the correct one, perhaps not. But one thing we know for sure is that he's the same guy he was when he shot the bartender. The justice system has resolved the issue for the town, which can now return to normal life. But it hasn't done a thing to Gazzara. And here's the main character in the film. And guess what her name is? Her name is Laura. Lee Remick we're talking about. The film's great mystery. Now, where is she when the film ends? She's the center of the film. She's its unknowable enigma, and she's gone. She's vanished to where we don't know. She's been taken by her husband, a man who might be abusive, who might be dangerous, who will probably not make her happy. She's been crying. That's one of the last things we hear in the movie is that she was crying. It's a hearkening back to the last scene in Bonjour Tristesse, where we see Gene Seberg's empty face and ruined future. And it's even a return to the last words of Laura, which are, "Goodbye, my love." There's a scene in the middle of the film where Stewart leaves Remick at the doorway of her trailer, and she has a tormented look on her face. She says, "I'm lonely, Paul, awfully lonely." But she doesn't seem to be trying to escape Gazzara. But nevertheless, she's restless, she's unhappy, and it's unsettling. Sometimes she's happy, and sometimes she seems almost scared. Her sadness hangs over the whole film, and particularly over the ending of the film. And it's what we're left with as we see her shoes in the trash in the film's last shot. Irony, doubt, and enigma. When the film ends, there's an overhang of melancholy, and nothing fundamental has been changed. Not a sad ending, certainly not a happy ending. It's just an ending that says this is how things are going to work when human beings are involved. Now, is this the stuff of great art? I'd say yes, obviously. You've already heard my opinion of Preminger. This is not an episode of Perry Mason. Yes, it's a mystery, and we're fascinated by the mystery, and we want to know what happened. But Anatomy of a Murder is not primarily the story of a murder or of a trial. It's a slice of humanity in a very particular place, with Duke Ellington's often whimsical music in the background. It's people doing what they do, which is not too different in Ishpeming. By the way, you never hear the word Ishpeming in the movie. They call the towns Iron City and Thunder Bay, but the actual towns are Big Bay and Ishpeming, and it's Marquette County, and it's the Upper Peninsula. They do refer to the Upper Peninsula. And anyway, the people in Ishpeming are the same as people everywhere. This could be New York, it could be Phoenix, it could be anywhere. And we watch all of this, and it's almost like we're eavesdropping, because that's Preminger's style as an artist. He's not forcing our eye, he's not leading us around. He's saying, here it is, have a good time, see if you can figure out what's important. Andrew Sarris wrote that Preminger was sincere, but also cynical. Preminger cares, but only so much. Mostly he's saying, look at these people, they're doing it again. This time they're doing it under the legal process. And later he would do similar stories in the world of politics, that's Advise and Consent. And then he would do it in the world of religion, that's The Cardinal. And then in the military, and that's a film called In Harm's Way. All great films, in my opinion. And they all come to the same inconclusive, not terribly satisfactory ends. It's Otto Preminger's view of humanity with all of its flaws and consequences. He didn't hate people, and he didn't love them either. I think he saw them flat on as they were. A lot of people just don't think Preminger could possibly be a good director because they know how he was in real life, yelling and screaming at people, and they see his films, and yeah, the films are good, but they look at Preminger and he's on talk shows, and they just think, how can this guy be a great director? They thought the same thing about Alfred Hitchcock, by the way. And he would promote his films, often in silly ways. Well, here's my advice to you when you're looking at any director, not just Otto Preminger. Look at the results on the screen. It's the same thing with Raoul Walsh, who directed a lot of great films in America in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and John Ford, who I think is the greatest English language director of all. And none of them seemed to a lot of people like they were doing anything, but they knew what they wanted. They knew the film they wanted to get on screen. And Preminger knew what he wanted, and he didn't have to fret about it. Lee Remick said that Preminger had the whole film in his head before he started. Every shot, every angle, every bit of business, just like Hitchcock. Hitchcock said that shooting the actual film was boring because by then he'd done all the creative work. He'd already made all the critical artistic decisions. The creation of great art is not linear. It's not a fully transparent process. You put a piece of paper in front of Picasso, you give him a couple of crayons, and he'll create something memorable in 30 seconds. He won't think about it. He won't fret about it or talk about what he's going to do. He'll just do it. So it is with a great film director. There's lots of little decisions that are made that lead to that result on screen. And they might not seem like much individually, but they lead to the film that Preminger already had in his imagination. The choice of Duke Ellington, the decision to shoot on location, the casting of the players. That's very important. The use of the objective eye rather than prescriptive edits and cues. The script. Now, somebody else gets credit for the script, a fellow named Wendell Mays, who was a Billy Wilder recommendation to Preminger. But Preminger was there working with Mays every moment. It's his script too. The choice of the material and more. These are all artistic decisions, and every one of them is part of the director's job, which is to get his artistic vision on screen. And Preminger, much more often than not, succeeded. And that is the end of my presentation. And now we can talk about anything you like for the remainder of the time that Pete says we have.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert. That was terrific. I've got at least one question from the audience already, and everybody else, please do drop your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. I'll go ahead and get us started. I'm curious where you addressed this somewhat in your presentation, but where you see this film fitting in kind of in the wider context of film history. Is it Mr. Smith Goes to the Courthouse? Is it the opposite side of 12 Angry Men? Do we have this film to thank for last year's like Mangrove and Trial of Chicago 7? Like how influential was it, and how many threads does it pick up from that which came before it?
Well, let's see. It's 7:50. I could easily talk for 40 minutes on courtroom films. This film is very important in the courtroom genre, and it comes right smack dab in the middle of what's called the golden age of the courtroom film, which began really with 12 Angry Men and ended with To Kill a Mockingbird. And these were all major films, all Best Picture nominees. Preminger had made a couple of them himself. He made a film called The Court Martial of Billy Mitchell, and he made a film called St. Joan. And in both of those films, trials play a major part. But you know, even in things like A Place in the Sun, there's a big trial scene at the end with Raymond Burr as the prosecuting lawyer. I laugh because Burr always played bad guys in the first 5 years of his career, always played bad guys. And now everybody knows him as sort of the ultimate good guy, Perry Mason, and then Ironside. And by the way, this is the tabloid side of my presentation. Probably most people watching won't even know the TV show Ironside. It was a big hit in the 60s. And Raymond Burr's in a wheelchair, and he plays a police detective who solves crimes. And he took that role because he was too lazy to walk around. He wanted a role where he could sit for the entire film and read all his lines off cue cards. So he's there in a wheelchair reading lines off cue cards, and he's the star of the show. And the show was a hit. It was on for years. But I digress. This film is really important because it took the courtroom genre and really turned it into a grown-up thing. This is not a dramatic Hollywood film. This is a film that makes a lot of subtle points about what the legal process is really like. Now, it is a little over-dramatic. Some of the stuff Stewart does in this film you wouldn't see in a courtroom. All the temper tantrums and the slamming of the hand on the table. I've never seen anything like that in a courtroom. But it's pretty realistic. And the whole tone of the film, which is that everybody's kind of a scamp in this film. You know, the prosecuting lawyer is a little sleazy, the defense lawyer is a little sleazy, the judge is a little sleazy. the characters in the movie are the defendant, I mean, Ben Gazzara, he could be as guilty as sin. He might have known exactly what he was doing. And Lee Remick might be lying about being raped, although she passed a lie detector test, and that's a really crucial piece of information. I'll tell you, for me, I believe her. And I believe Gazzara. And a lot of people would disagree with that. Ben Gazzara disagreed with that. He said, I knew I was guilty of sin. But I believe he was innocent. I think in this movie, I'm a lawyer, you know, I can assess evidence. I'm pretty smart. I think he's innocent based on the law at the time, and that law was changed. Another little legal detail, by the way, is that some people wonder, well, why wasn't he facing the death penalty? It is murder. It's first-degree murder is what this case is all about. Well, the reason is they never had the death penalty in Michigan since about 1860. Michigan, I believe, was the first state to get rid of it. And it had been already gone for 100 years when this film was made. So he was facing life in prison, not the death penalty. But this is a very grown-up courtroom film. But as I also said, you know, my idea of a great courtroom film is Woody Allen's Bananas or maybe John Waters' Serial Mom. Those are my favorite courtroom scenes. Duck Soup. Duck Soup is just a brilliant courtroom scene. The Lady from Shanghai. And in Lady from Shanghai and Bananas, we have the same thing where the lawyer actually cross-examines himself. He gets on the stand and then he runs off the stand and asks himself questions. But this is the film that lawyers and law professors think is the most accurate film about a trial, the most accurate film about what lawyers do and how they behave.
I had another question related to that, but before, I don't want to just ask all the questions and not give the audience a chance. So I've got a question from Pam Pei. She'd like to hear what your explanation of just your interpretation of the title. What does the title mean? How does it relate? Why did you land on it?
I had a little spiel about the title, but I cut it out because it was going to take too much time. I don't like the title because it's not a murder. Remember, the jury said it wasn't a murder. That's what the film is all about. It's a killing, but we don't know if it's a murder. A murder is a term of art. Murder is something that the jury has to decide. And in another Preminger film, Angel Face, Leon Ames said, the law is what the jury says it is. The facts are what the jury says it is. This is no murder. It was found to be a killing with an excuse. So it's not a murder. And Ben Gazzara, after being examined by a psychiatrist, because remember, he pleaded insanity in the film. You can't just walk away after you plead insanity. In real life, the guy who did the killing had to be examined by a psychiatrist. And then after he was found sane, he was free to go. And you can look online, by the way, and see the real people who are involved in this crime. The woman is no Lee Remick, let me tell you. That's the biggest difference. She looks like a woman who lives in a trailer. And the husband looks a lot like the prosecuting lawyer, the guy with the mustache, not George C. Scott, but the other guy, who, by the way, in real life was married to Eve Arden. That was Eve Arden's husband, and it's the only movie he ever made. And this is Otto Preminger kind of saving money and getting all the spouses on the set. But he was good. He was perfectly good in that film. He had to play kind of a incompetent lawyer, not incompetent, but just a lawyer who was overshadowed by super competent lawyers. That's a better way to put it. Because James Stewart was really good. And George C. Scott was good, but not so good in front of a jury. George C. Scott is a little too nasty. Great trial lawyers want to be liked. They don't want to appear nasty. They want to appear avuncular. They want the jury to like them. And Scott scores a lot of points, but you know, that's not always a good thing if the jury doesn't like you. So anyway, I don't like the word murder in the title. And I think anatomy is one of those things where, you know, if you're not a professional writer, you're sitting around trying to think of a fancy word to use in your book, and that's the word you come up with. You know, the logo for the film showed a body that was divided up into parts and they had been disconnected. There were 2 arms and there was a torso and there were 2 legs, and that had been designed by Saul Bass, who did the credits for the movie. Very famous guy. He did all the credits for all of Preminger's films, for all of Hitchcock's films. If you remember the great credits for Vertigo or for Psycho or North by Northwest, those were all Saul Bass. And more recently, he did the credits for Goodfellas, the Scorsese film with the bullets, you know, da-da-da-da-da-da. That was Saul Bass. And then he did Casino, where Robert De Niro is flying through the air through the bombing of the car. That was all Saul Bass, and he designed that body that was divided into sections. But the whole point of the title is obviously that this is a killing, and we're going to take it apart now legally and then put it up together again. I just don't like the word murder in there because it's not a murder. And it's presumptuous to call it a murder until we've had the trial.
We've talked about this stuff a little bit in your question or your answers to our questions already, but I wanted to come back to it. So this film is more procedural than a lot of courtroom dramas I've seen, where it spends a lot of time with like the research and just kind of like the nitty gritty of the day to day of being a lawyer. You see that it comes up, it's cited quite a bit, including by you in this presentation, as being one of the great, if not the best, trial movies of all time. How representative of it, like how accurate is this dramatization of just like the work of being in like law libraries and things like that? Is that all pretty on point?
I think it's on point if you're a small town lawyer and a sole practitioner. It has nothing to do. I worked on Wall Street for one of the biggest firms in America, a big New York firm. It's nothing like that practice. And the practice in this movie is so much more interesting and so much better than what the poor lawyers in those poor, pathetic big firms are doing, because they're spending days and days going through boxes of documents, and you very rarely even get to a courtroom. You'll generally spend tens of thousands of man hours going through material, and then you'll settle the case. And here in this case, the day before the trial, you see James Stewart in the courthouse library, which by the way was really the Ishpeming Carnegie Library, and it was not really in the courthouse. The door the judge opened to see the library was actually the door to the restroom in the courthouse. But Preminger wanted to have the library in the courthouse, so he opened the door to the restroom. It's like opening the door to the Emerald City in The Wizard of Oz. You open the door and it's in color and it's the Emerald City. So you open the restroom door, and instead of seeing urinals, you see a law library. And there's James Stewart saying, look, right here in the ALR. Now, the ALR stands for American Legal Reports. And I took contracts at the University of Chicago from Antonin Scalia, who was a tough guy. He was like Kingsfield in The Paper Chase. By the way, Pete, if you ever do The Paper Chase, I'd love to talk about that film, because that's my era. I went to law school in the 70s, and that's the 70s. But, you know, for the ALR to get a mention in a movie is really cool. And that's how we did research back then. You went through books. Now, nobody goes to law libraries and nobody looks at books. It's all online. And you'll type in keywords. And, you know, for example, if you were doing this case now, you'd do all the insanity cases online from Michigan. And you could narrow it down as much as you wanted. It would all be up to date. You'd have no chance of missing a case. You'd have no chance of missing you know, something being overturned. It's not, you know, I sound like an old grizzled guy, but it's just not the art it used to be. But it was pretty accurate for small town practice back then. And Stewart is really, really good as a lawyer in this film. A little over dramatic, but he's really good. That's how a lawyer is supposed to be. The way he responds to the other side and the way he plays to the jury. He lets the dog out, you know, for no reason other than to curry favor with the jurors, to entertain them for a minute. And he puts that frog lure in the book that the judge opens, and then he makes friends with the judge, and George C. Scott is, you know, realizes he's been had again in the background. But that stuff all happens. So yes, it's pretty accurate for that practice at that time.
You've just led me into another one of the questions I wanted to ask you. But before I do that, for one thing, those of you in the audience, if you have a question you want to ask, we're at about last call now. I've got a couple from the audience and at least one of my own. But yeah, we're at 7:59, so I need to start wrapping things up. But yeah, we'll ask at least 3 more questions, if not more. So you've got a minute or 2 here. So first from Charles Jacobson, this is more of a comment than a question, but you might want to follow up. Charles says, often movie legal depictions and procedures are not shown emotional enough for those involved in the courtroom. Preminger does a great service by emphasizing this.
Could you say that again?
Yeah. Charles says, often movie legal depictions and procedures are not shown and emotional enough for those involved and in the courtroom. Preminger does a great service by emphasizing this.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question is. I may have missed a word here or there.
There's not really a question. It was just a comment. Yeah.
Well, there are some things in the movie, you know, watching this as a lawyer, I have a friend who's a law professor at the University of Michigan, and he used this film to teach. because there's some ethical issues that come up in this movie. And is James Stewart coaching the witness, for example? Does he coach Ben Gazzara into pleading insanity? See, again, I don't think so. But he said it was close. I don't think it's that close. I don't think he did it. And there's another issue. Was George C. Scott wrong to bring that prisoner out when they knew he was probably going to lie? Well, you're entitled to believe your witnesses. If he knew he was going to lie, if he really knew, then yes, that's an ethical breach. But you're allowed to believe that people are telling the truth unless you know they're not. And the big moment in the movie, which I think is a little bit overly dramatic, is when James Stewart says, I beg the court, I beg the judge to let me get the information in on what he's talking about is the rape. He wants the rape to be able to be discussed, because for the first half of the trial, they can't talk about the rape. And then the judge brings it in. Remember, the only issue here is whether Ben Gazzara is legally insane when he shoots the bartender. And the rape is important because it gives Gazzara an excuse, a reason to be so upset. And honestly, I think in real life, yes, it would get in. And if it didn't get in, I think it would probably be overturned on appeal. But that's treated as this big turning point. And Preminger pauses. And then the judge thinks for a minute. And then he says, I'm going to sustain that. So they get to talk about the rape. And one of the things I like about the movie is that we don't see the closing arguments. We certainly don't need those. The film is 2 hours and 40 minutes long. We've already seen a lot of the trial anyway. We know the facts. We don't need to hear George C. Scott and James Stewart go over them one more time. But in courtroom films, they usually have closing arguments because that's where the actors get to do all their big flamboyant stuff. And there's another movie made right around this time, another courthouse film, which is actually pretty good, called Compulsion, about the Leopold Loeb murders near the University of Chicago in the 1920s, I believe. And these were two kids who wanted to prove that Darwin was right and that they were the fittest and this other kid was not. And so they figured they would commit the perfect crime and kidnap this kid and murder him. And they did do that, and then they got caught, and they wound up both going to prison. And that's a long story, but they made a movie about it. And there was a big. Clarence Darrow was the lawyer who defended the two people and got them life in prison rather than the death penalty. And in the movie, that role is played by Orson Welles. And the big scene in the movie is the closing argument, the big scene. That's where Welles just does all his flamboyant Orson Welles stuff. And it's really a pretty good scene. But this is a different kind of movie. This is not a big Hollywood dramatic movie. There's no moralizing in this movie. And there's none of this theatrical stuff other than the fake jokes and the fake anger that you see in the trial. So yes, I like the way he handled all of that. And I like the fact that we didn't get these long drawn out speeches by the lawyers in this film.
Okay. Next, we've got a question from Jessica. She says, why do you think Preminger chose to work with Duke Ellington on this particular project? How do you think the soundtrack fits in, tonally speaking?
Soundtrack is terrific. It's considered one of the great soundtracks in film history. And Ellington, as I said, if you took a vote among music scholars and asked them to name the greatest American musician, I mean all musicians from the start of the country to now, Ellington would get a lot of votes. He might finish number one. My own pick would be Charlie Parker, but that's another story for another day. Ellington had a lot longer time to produce a body of work, but Parker, I think, was just off the charts in his ability to compose on the fly and to play and everything else. I think the soundtrack works beautifully. Again, it's used sparingly. It sort of fills in the blanks when we don't have people talking. When we see Stewart driving his car from one place to another, and when he's walking into his house, something like that. That's what, and also at the very end of the movie when we see those shoes in the trash can, and we're left with this feeling of sort of emptiness. It feels sort of satisfying in a way, but also like, oh gee, here we go again. And he captures that. I think it's an absolutely brilliant soundtrack, and he wrote it right there with everybody else. He wrote it on site while they were making the film. Preminger wanted him there the whole time. And by the way, he was the only black guy probably on the Upper Peninsula when they were making this movie. Well, I know of at least one more black guy, and that would be Billy Strayhorn, who was Preminger's musical associate. Preminger's common law wife was there too. I don't know if she was black or white, but she was there. And Strayhorn was the guy who was actually playing the piano when it looked like James Stewart was playing the piano. And Strayhorn also wrote that stuff that you hear at the very end of the film when they're waiting for the verdict, and Stewart is playing kind of a boogie-woogie version of Dixie or whatever it is he's playing. That's really Billy Strayhorn. Strayhorn was another great figure. He wrote Lush Life, and he wrote apparently a lot of the stuff that Ellington takes credit for was actually written at least partly by Billy Strayhorn. But you know, they were there the whole time, and they wrote it while everybody else was making the film, and they finished it as the film was wrapping, and then the film ended shooting, and a month later it was edited and finished and previewed, and the previews were successful, and Preminger released it about 2 weeks later. The premiere was in Detroit, which of course is Michigan. There had been an earlier preview on the Upper Peninsula, but that's really fast for a movie that's 2 hours and 40 minutes long to be wrapped up and then released in a month. That's unheard of. But that, like I said, this was just a really successful, happy shoot. Everything went well. And Preminger knew what he was doing. He was a pro. He got it all on film, and it was easy to cut and easy to turn into a movie.
That's sort of, again, that leads to that question I was going to ask a couple of questions ago. So I'll do this as the last question, and then we'll call it a night, I think. It's come up a lot that the movie's so long. It's 2 hours and 40 minutes long. And I feel like the structure is kind of weirdly loose. As you've said, it's a very like entertaining film. Like you don't really feel the length. But that said, I feel like there are a lot of scenes in it that, like, if it were made in Hollywood now, they'd force them to cut out. One that comes immediately to mind is like at the beginning of the second act when they finally make it to the courtroom. There's the first guy that comes out and he stole the box of the good bourbon. He drank it all himself. Like, it doesn't really advance the plot. What is Preminger up to? I really like those scenes, but what do you think he's up to with that looseness when like it's such a long film in the first place?
Well, that scene, you know, there is a lot of stuff he didn't include, like those closing arguments. And there are other times in the movie where you think you're going to get something and then he cuts away. And I think, good, you know, I really don't want to watch that. But that scene with the guy who stole the bourbon, which is an amusing scene, you know, he says, I'm going to have to appoint a lawyer for you. He says, you don't need to appoint a lawyer for me. I'm guilty. I did it. And, you know, he says, well, did you sell? He says, no, I drank it and it was worth it. It was really good. He's just some old pathetic drunk, but a very likable guy. And the judge likes him. And the judge says, well, we're going to have to. What that scene was all about was introducing the judge to the audience. And that judge was, again, the guy in the Army McCarthy hearings. His name was Joseph Welch. This is the only film he ever made. It's funny because when this film showed in Europe at one of those big film festivals, I can't remember which one it was. I don't think it was Cannes, might have been Venice. That judge was voted most promising newcomer. He's 68, he never made another movie. So, you know, and another thing I want to point out is that he's not really very good in the film. He's very likable. You know, he's fun to watch, but if you are a student of acting, there are two bad actors in this film, two people who clearly don't know what they're doing when it comes to acting. One is Duke Ellington, who only has a few lines, and he just, you know, he says, are you splitting the scene? He says that to James Stewart when they're sitting at the piano. You can tell he's a guy who's just reading a line somebody gave him. And then Stewart starts talking, and boom, we're back to something that sounds like it's actually happening. With Ellington talks, it's like a guy reading a line, and then we go to something actually happening. And with Joseph Welch, one of the sources I read, and I always read everything when I do one of these films, one source said he was reading off of 2 different teleprompters when he was doing the movie. And if you watch the movie, you'll notice he turns his head one way, and then he turns his head another way, and then he turns. So maybe that's true. Another thing about Joseph Welch is that Preminger knew he wasn't a pro, so he didn't ask him to do anything but sit and give his lines. He would not ask him to walk and talk at the same time. There are scenes of him walking, like he walks into the courtroom, or there's a scene with him and his cane walking along the sidewalk, and he never says anything. He can do that. He can walk. All the scenes of him talking, he's sitting behind his judge's bench or he's in his office. And he's a very likable guy, and he's a celebrity. Everybody knew who he was. And he's really good in this movie. You know, he does fine as a judge. Judges are kind of stiff anyway. They have to give these little spiels. But he gives his spiel about who he is and how he's going to handle the case during that scene you were talking about with the guy who stole the bourbon. Because he's not the normal judge for the Upper Peninsula. He's been brought in from downstate because the local judge is sick. And of course, the George C. Scott character is not a local either. He came from the big city of Lansing, Michigan. And, you know, we're supposed to all be intimidated by that. The big city of Lansing, Michigan. And he, in my opinion, kind of, you know, realizes that being a slick, smart lawyer isn't always the best way to be. He's a little too, and he screws up in the final scene of the film where he questions Mary Pallant and asks a question that he doesn't know the answer to. And she gives an answer that he didn't expect. And that's how the trial ends. And even though it's not dispositive of anything, it's not the way he wanted the trial to end. He says, no further questions. And then we cut and we go to Stewart and Arthur O'Connell and Eve Arden waiting for the verdict.
Well, I feel like I should insert a no further questions joke here because we've come to the end of the presentation. It's 8:11. We're a little past time. As I wrap things up, I've got one stupid correction. I talked for 5 minutes of these things and I still managed to make a dumb error. I was saying in my introduction, unrelated to Preminger, that the director of Power of Kangwon Province, Hong Sang-soo, went to the University of Chicago. He did not. He went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I just got my brain tangled up there.
Well,
so I apologize.
Another great institution.
It is, yeah. But yeah, I'm sorry for confusing my Chicago universities. But that said, thank you so much, Robert. This has been a very delightful and enlightening presentation, and I hope to have you back. Well, I will have you back. Everybody come and see Robert when he speaks on August 28th about Two English Girls. But yeah, we've got one more of these next week, Renee Thomas Woods on Carmen Jones, and then on hiatus for a little while. Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you again, Robert.
Thank you.